Ed, it's great to have you here. Looking forward to hearing the talk. And with that, I will let Mernaz introduce and take it away. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you so much. Everybody here knows Melissa, but Melissa heads the Bachelor of Urban Design program. And she has basically founded and started the program from 2016 and has been developing it fantastically since then.
Great to meet you, Melissa. Thank you, Manaz.
Sure. Ed, I'll just say hi to everyone. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much, Ed, for accepting our invitation. I am very pleased to introduce Ed to all of you. Ed is the academic leader in Landscape Architecture and Urbanism program at Greenwich University in London. He's also a visiting professor at Milan Polytechnic. And by education and background, Ed is an landscape architect and urban designer. And he has completed his PhD in economics from London School of Economics, where he has explored the relations between different ways that public spaces have been made and remade in London. Ed has written widely for a variety of journals, Urban Landscape, the Journal of Landscape Institute, Topos, and very many other journals. He has also written several books. The very recent book he has co-edited with Tim Waterman is Landscape and Agency. Also, he has co-founded Testing Ground, which is a journal of landscape, cities, and territories. Ed is also a guest editor at Architectural Design Journal. Ed also has founded Project Studio, which is his practice, research, and academic works. And it showcases many of the shortlisted and winning collaborations and projects, such as Roaming Forest for Landscape Urbanism Biennale 2010, Park Walks for 2012, and many more. Ed's interest is at the intersection of architecture, landscape, and urbanism. And as far as I've spoken to him, his research has been at the intersection of how landscape can affect the cities, and also vice versa. He's a very warm, very open minded and hearted person. He has been very kind to us. He gracefully gave us a beautiful tour of the Landscape Architecture and Urbanism department, which has these fully fledged labs of landscape. And I found him an extremely energetic, warm, and nice person, as personally also. So thank you very much, and then over to you.
Manas, thank you very much for your generous introduction. I think that sure. I'm not often given such a warm welcome, particularly over Zoom. We have a habit of Zoom of going through our introductions very quickly. So thank you so much for welcoming me, sure. Inviting me to join you at CEP today. Thank you, Melissa, for also extending the invitation. I'm particularly interested in the work that you do as a team at CEPTA, because as I mentioned, I'm in the process of building a bachelor's of urban design here at Greenwich, and they're quite unique programs. So I've been paying a lot of attention to the work that you've been doing in building your programs. Thank you also to the students for accommodating me. I hope that some of the work that I present is of interest. Let me just share my screen so we can focus less on my face and more on the work. Let's have a look, see if we can do this. Okay, how is that? Can we see an opening slide?
Yep.
Yeah, great. Okay. So today I'd like to talk about, I suppose, particular relationships between cities and landscapes that frame much of the work that I've done over the last probably 10 years. As Manat's described, I initially trained in landscape architecture in Manchester in England and worked for a number of years as a landscape architect before training in urban design and then undertaking doctoral studies in cities program at the London School of Economics. And through that time, I suppose I've been consistently fascinated by the relationship between landscape and cities, the way in which we could understand them to inform each other, but also for us to understand the intense overlaps, both conceptually and materially, between cities and landscapes. And there's three, let's say, themes that run through this work, I suppose, and they come from my belief that there are some unique qualities to landscapes around landscape as a relational medium, landscape as something which is inherently time-based and that works through ecologies of scales. And through these, let's say, different ways of understanding landscape, I suppose my presentation today makes an argument for an understanding of landscape that gives us a greater understanding for both researching and designing cities. The presentation, just briefly, I will talk a little bit about these, let's say, intersections between cities and landscapes. I'll also give, I suppose, an emphasis to what I've termed in the past as post-landscapes, the idea that the particular way in which we approach landscape, which is certainly dominant in London and England and large parts of the Western world, should not be considered the only way in which we see and relate to the worlds around us. And Barbara Bender, the anthropologist, describes that at the time when the term landscape was emerging and advancing in England and the Western world, there were many other landscapes, other ways of relating to the world. And I think that I'd like to, let's say, give an emphasis to the importance of these other landscapes. And let me start with, see if I can click through my slides here. Let's start with a drawing which is, I suppose, a drawing which I begin much of my thinking about landscape with, which is the valley section drawing by Patrick Geddes. As I was preparing for the lecture today, I realized that those of you in SEPT have probably a greater familiarity with Geddes when he visited your city in 1915 and did a walk around the fortifications to advocate, let's say, a particular understanding of the landscape of the city. And I think Geddes has an extremely wide, let's say, range of work and array of thinking, but it's particularly the valley section drawing, which you see here, the 1909 drawing, which I think is worth spending, I suppose, some time looking into. Firstly, from a landscape perspective, it allows us to see the relationships between social activities, what people are doing, and the land around them. The physical forms of the land, of the forest, of the arable fields, the fisherman's relationship with the sea. But behind this, let's say, basic structure of the valley section, in this 1909 drawing, we also see horizontal relationships between the mountains, the fields, and the different forms of urban settlement, from the largest city, the metropolis on the coast, to the towns and the villages and the hamlets further up the hills. And in a sense, for me, this valley section drawing provides a basis for some of my understanding about relationships between cities and landscapes, but also an argument for a further exploration, a further experimentation with these relationships. So the 1909 drawing came after other versions of the valley section that Geddes drew. In 1888, we see within his publication around the rise of botany, a valley section drawing that didn't include urban settlements. But by 1905, he's beginning to draw the city on the coast and in front of the hills going up to the background. And he describes within, with the publication of the 1905 valley section drawing, as the coming together of the different natural occupations of the land within the city. And reflecting to a certain degree the writing of Michael Sorkin, late Michael Sorkin, who wrote a lot about particularly North American cities, but describing the city as an accumulation of the social. I think the importance here of the social relationships which form cities, I think it's something again which I'll hopefully give a feel for within the work. And also I'd like to maybe underline the need for us to look beyond quite simplistic separations between town and country, city and landscape, even the inside and outside of cities, as we begin to think about the more urban concepts that and more complex urban concepts that we need to work with as urban designers. By 1923, Geddes published this valley section drawing, which in the top part of the drawing, we see, I suppose, a more detailed version of Geddes's earlier work, where we see the woodsman in the forest and the farmer, the peasant in the agricultural fields, coming down to the coast where the fishing is happening. But we also see a translation of this regional scale model down to the scale of a high street. And for me, with this 1923 drawing, I take, let's say, Geddes's further exploration of the valley section at different scales, of different activities, different social relations, as an opportunity to further explore what the valley section might mean 100 years later, in 2020. What are the social, ecological, varied relationships that come together to form landscapes and cities? And how can we begin to read them as researchers, but also work with them propositionally as designers? And there's a number of projects I'm going to show today. I'm going to show 5 projects. This is a slide from one of them, which in different ways, they try to bring together this idea of, let's say, the relational nature of landscape, the importance of time and change, and that's, I suppose, the complexity of many of these relationships, particularly as we're working with digital networks and relationships, overlaid and bound up with our more physical material relations. And as I was preparing for the lecture, I realized that even back in 2001, when I was working in landscape architecture practice in the north of England, many of the drawings I was doing were still trying to explore these relationships. In this case, relationships between times of the day, patterns of weather, the activities of a small public square. And I think for us to continue, let's say, this exploration, I think can bear a lot of interest, develop quite a lot of interesting results. This year, the beginning of this year, I was lucky enough to, I suppose, be to receive a copy of an issue of Architectural Design, which I guest edited, and included many people who I've respected for a long time: theorists, designers, ecologists, artists, exploring this notion of redefining landscape relations. And I think that one of the great things about this, I suppose, the role I've had in the last 15 years working in more academic practice has been this opportunity to bring together a design practice and a research practice, and work with many people who have ideas and work which has informed my own. So there's three particular, say, things I'd like to, us to think about when we are questioning, challenging, unpacking Patrick Geddes' Valley section in the current, I say, in our current time, in 2020. The first is thinking about the new and other spaces, practices, and people that are part of our contemporary and future landscapes. Patrick Geddes composed his Valley section drawings with the physical landscape, usually in the background, then the different practices that people undertook, and looking at the tools in which they used to engage with them. And I think if we are to continue, let's say, or if we to begin an exploration of Patrick Geddes' work, it's important for us to think about what are the contemporary landscapes which we're working with as urban designers. Where are, for example, the landscapes of oil fields or oil refinement? Where are the military bases? Where are the gated communities or the refugee camps, the informal settlements? Or even where are the settlements that are less attached to, I suppose, traditions of the land, such as space stations and activities on the ocean? I think it's also important for us to consider the different scales that we might be working with, going beyond the regional scale that Geddes frequently predominantly limited himself to think about the more planetary relations that come to define both our projects as urban designers, but also the landscapes and the cities that we study. If we're to think about the practices that we are exposed to, that are part of our contemporary lives, we also need to look beyond the practices of the Valley section, which are predominantly those undertaken by men and those undertaken in a more Western world that Geddes was familiar. The Valley section is, and the occupations of the Valley section are very familiar to me growing up in the Highlands of Scotland, but I think less relevant to many people in other geographies. But to think about the less visible work that still existed at the time of Geddes, such as the domestic work, often undertaken by women, which is excluded from the Valley section, office work, leisure activities. Also, if we were to think about how these forms of work engage, the devices for engaging with the landscape, the digital tools, or the indigenous technologies. And if we bring these together and think about how our current situation, working remotely, I'm sitting here in my bedroom in South London, not in the university in which I spend much of my time, and the ways in which remote working also can transform the relationships that we have with the places around us. And then the third, the people, the women, the children, the elderly, which are not present in Geddes' Valley section, which he recognizes is dominated by men, but also the many people of the city that the sociologist William White describes as those considered to be less desirable. So the homeless, sex workers, where do they find presence within a contemporary understanding of the Valley section, as well as individuals who may have an interest in not being included, such as the landowners, the politicians, people who make big decisions about landscape are often excluded from diagrams such as the Valley section. And then the two further issues, the concern for change. I think that landscapes for me are bound up with change, whether this is non-human processes such as growth and decay and erosion and sedimentation, which for me are a core part of cities, as well as the more natural landscapes, but also the human-informed processes such as urbanization, climate change, and how through particular actions we can begin to think about our role in design in informing the actions that can transform or steer these different processes, and how these actions have a politics about them, how they relate to, they're important for our relationships with each other and the rest of the world. And then this third notion of incompleteness, I think it's not the right term for what I'm wanting to describe, but in a sense, this is the considerations of the valley section through a more critical lens, thinking about the areas that are missing from the valley section, whether this is the certain people, certain scales, certain perspectives, whether it's the uneven distribution of resources and things that confront us in our everyday lives, which I think Geddes overlooks in a valley section, which looks quite even and balanced. The many invisible entities of the valley section, such as property boundaries, other species, weather patterns, which we can understand through developing a diagram such as the valley section. We will exclude, we will omit certain aspects. And it's important for us to remind ourselves when we're thinking about our contemporary lives, the levels of complexity in which we need to work. As I promised you, I'm going to show 5 projects, and this is the first one. Each of the projects, they are projects which I've done with many colleagues, balancing, I suppose, between the university and my design studio, and finding opportunities through the projects to explore some of the issues or concerns which I have with urban life and landscape, and also, I suppose, the privilege of doing this type of work within a university. So Lubricity is a project which was initiated through a workshop at the Royal Academy and the Architecture Foundation back in 2013, where there's a team of 5 teams were invited to develop proposals for a future scenario of London. And working with 4 friends and colleagues, architects, urban designers, ecologists, engineers, we identified the location on the edge of London that we were interested to explore. And this is a part of, we see the Thames here in black coming in from the North Sea. The grey hatched area on the outskirts of London is the green belt, which is the zone that was defined in the post-war, post-Second World War period for protecting the growth or trying to slow down the growth of London. And we were interested in this particular landscape because it's a landscape which is defined very much by movement. It's defined by certain horizontality and certain sort of instability and high degrees of change. And the term lubricity comes, I suppose, to pick up some of these particular notions and terms. Zooming in a little bit, we see the Thames in black, and this grey area here is the area of potential flooding. London being or the Thames being a tidal river, it is at risk of flooding. And this site in particular is outside of the flood protections that of the Thames barrier that are put in place to protect London. So we're in a location which potentially could be sacrificed in the threat of flooding, sacrificed to protect London. It's a very horizontal landscape, quite suburban, peri-urban. It's also got an intense ecosystem based around the mud flats and the tidal areas. It's a site that we were very interested in exploring for these particular conditions, and we're interested in the life of this landscape, the existence of this landscape as part of London, but also somewhere that is outside of London, somewhere that is within the legislative boundaries of London, but outside of other particular ways in which London is enclosed. We looked at a number of historic structures and ways for managing the river. We're interested in the role and the importance of the river within this landscape. The river as a means for trade and commerce, but also one which is often a threat to the activities in this part of London. And we came up with, let's say, 4 particular terms for exploring this part of the outskirts. The first being limits, thinking about the limits of flooding, the limits of the city, the limits of growth. We're thinking about the horizontal nature of fields, and the not just fields as agricultural elements, but fields within, I suppose, the terms of landscape urbanism as these places that are both productive, but also inhabitable. The notion of an armature we borrowed from Professor Graham Shane in New York City, and his research is urban research, and thinking about how the armature of a bridge could be used as a way to bring together and connect the different activities and programs of the landscape. And then the ecological the ecologies, of the ecological relationships, but also the wider industrial and social relations from which this part of London are defined. And we set out a series of diagrams looking at these limits, and we set up a number of, I suppose, scenes, a number of images coming from, I suppose, a tradition, or a picturesque tradition of landscape based on what the landscape looks like, to think about how we may work with the existing limits of the city. In the background is the existing bridge of the Dartford crossing. It's the last bridge crossing of the Thames, and the interventions we're putting in place, trying to create another more pedestrian-oriented crossing, and in the foreground, breaks to the river wall to allow parts of this landscape to flood, to stimulate the biodiversity within the formerly agricultural fields. And with each of these 4 categories, we developed a series of diagrams, trying to think about the individual elements separately before then bringing them together in different ways to try out, I suppose, to experiment with what this, let's say, future complexity may be. We explored we were proposing to plant fields of sunflowers to provide goods for the local margarine factory and energy production. In the background of this image, we see a sort of a large bridge structure. This is the armature which passes through the landscape. It's a place for work in an attempt to encourage people who live locally to this landscape to not spend all of their time commuting in and out of London, but to recognize the particular work practices that may occupy this place. The usefulness of this project for us was one of exploring ideas that relate to London, and it, I think, allowed us to collaborate as academics and practitioners in ways in which many built projects don't allow us the same space to do so. And it's interesting, at the moment I have a graduate PhD student who I'm working with in this very area, dealing with similar questions, but more through traditional forms and practices of research. So the way in which we work together developing these projects is something I'm going to take a pause and mention. The call for teams that was put out by the Architecture Foundation asked for a lead for the project. They wanted one person to take charge of the team, and they wanted that person to be an architect. And I, partly, I'm sure, by the fact that I'm not a qualified architect, but trained originally in landscape architecture, I thought I didn't understand why you would undertake an urban project and have to be an architect. I also think it's interesting to explore different hierarchies of working when working in teams together. So we put together a team, and we refused to have a single person leading the team, and we refused to have that, an architect leading the team. And the way in which we worked was over the 3-month workshop. Every week we got together in a small Mexican cafe in the center of London, and we discussed ideas, and we drew many drawings, and we worked through the ideas together. And while there's 2 members of the 5 people in the team who did most of the drawing, the ideas were absolutely the result of a collective discourse. And I think that often we underplay the importance and the possibilities of teamwork, because we can feel as if we are working more efficiently individually. We may feel impatient with many of our team members who have different skills than us. But I can't see a project which I've undertaken that I've done in my professional life as an academic and a practitioner that hasn't involved multiple people contributing to the final result. And I think for me, this project, the Lubricity project, really kind of brought that to the fore, because the way in which we worked, we were all very busy at the time. We weren't all able to commit the same amount of time to the project. So this particular way of working as a team, getting together every week, was extremely productive for us. Going back several years, in 2010, I had the opportunity to realize a physical project, a very small physical project, for the Landscape Urbanism Biennale in Bat Yam in Israel. And this was the second of the biennales that was exploring how, I suppose, exploring some of the early ideas around landscape urbanism, and bringing together different people and different practitioners across art, architecture, landscape, urban design, to think about relationships between landscape and cities, generally through quite small projects. And I was interested at the time in thinking about how the way in which we produce public spaces is argued by many people outside of architecture in particular to be a manifestation of social relations. And I was interested in that we also consider landscape relationally. And if we look at the work of the writing of Barbara Bender, she describes landscapes in her book as not so much artifact, but rather a process of construction and reconstruction. And having read and written about the importance of processes and landscapes, I was, I suppose, encouraged by the writing of André Kubotz, the architect and philosopher from Switzerland, who wrote that it's not enough just to declare that land is about processes. We actually need to do more. And in this small project, the Roaming Forest project, I attempted in a sense to explore how the coming together of different social relations and ecological relations can, I suppose, bring about a rethinking of public space, collective spaces in cities. So I set out a plan that, first of all, we would identify a site. Now, I wasn't familiar with the city and I'd never visited before we developed the proposal. So the idea was we'd identify a site and we would plant a series of small trees, as you would in a plant nursery. And then through a period of the trees growing, we would then undercut the trees, which is basically cutting underneath them to stimulate the roots of the trees as they grew. And after the second time you undercut a tree, usually in a nursery, you will transplant the tree into a container or another form of containing the roots before taking that tree somewhere and planting it, maybe in a street or a park or a garden. And the idea was that we would put these small trees into containers, which were small pieces of furniture, and these containers would be able to be moved around the city by individuals, small groups of people, and they would allow a different way of forming the landscape of the city. So depending on the weight and the size and whether the furniture had wheels or not, these different pieces of furniture could be and were moved around the city. This is a photo of one of the containers that was built for the Biennale, with the branches of the tree still tied up. And the idea was that the containers were intentionally quite flimsy, so that where the seating elements began to decompose, then the tree would be planted where it stood. So we would see the trees moving or being moved throughout the city, forming small urban spaces or urban public spaces. They may be used to close off residential streets. They might be even taken and people might steal them and put them in the garden. But where these containers deteriorate, the trees would then be planted. So we would have a way of defining spaces in the city, which isn't led by a master plan or the single idea of an architect, but they would be the formation of the city would be defined in varying ways by individuals, collectors of people, and the municipality. And when we finished the project, there was a number of, let's say, images, which now I often use as reference images, which I've come across since. And one here is by one of my professors and mentor, Michael Sorkin, for his master plan of East New York. The idea that a single tree can be planted and it can cause and it can create significant transformations in the way in which the city works. I think continues to, I'd say, inspire me when we're thinking about the smaller urban projects which we undertake. The third project I want to show you, it's called Parkworks, and this was a development of the roaming forest project. I think often when we see, I say, small architectural studios being founded, doing small urban public realm work, it's quite common. These projects are often quite temporal. They're very useful ways of trying out ideas and developing an independent body of work. I was interested in the next project that I did to think about how we could take some of these ideas, which are about relationships and which are about challenging master plans, questioning the design as an object, and with a number of colleagues and friends, we developed a project called Parkworks, which was to explore a much larger landscape with similar principles. I was also interested in how we could continue a conversation around public space. And Dori Massey, in her book For Space, she asked the question of how we might address the question of the social relations which could construct any new and better notion of public space. So it's not about public space as an architectural object, but thinking about the relations that come together to form it. Okay, so in 2011, there was a call for entries for a design competition in Des Moines, Iowa, in the United States, with I'm not sure if you can see this video, but there's a video playing here showing us really where Des Moines is. Des Moines is the capital of Iowa. It's in the center of an agricultural landscape that's very much defined by sort of a network of grids. And there's an existing park called the Waterworks Park, and the competition was to redesign the park, thinking about the programming, thinking about making the park resilient to flooding of the river that passes through the park. And again, having not visited Des Moines or Iowa, as in Bethlehem, I was interested to think about how we could set up a framework that isn't imposing a single idea that we have from a distance, but is beginning to recognize the unique qualities of the landscape and using this reading of the landscape as a way of developing a design strategy. When we developed the first phase of the proposal, first phase of the competition from which we were shortlisted, some of the judges, they were concerned that we were developing some type of pseudo parc de la Villette. We had proposed a number of what we call nodes within the park. And the way we represented those nodes was with a series of red crosses, which looked very similar to some of the drawings of Bernard Schumi and his project Parc de la Villette. But what we did recognize the value of Schumi's project is the grid as a very useful organizing structure, a way that we can break down this very large landscape. The park in Des Moines is twice the size of Central Park in New York City. And beginning to think about it in design terms, it was necessary for us to be able to understand how people might inhabit the space as people, as families, as friends, but also understand the networks and the wider relationships between the park and the city and the wider watershed. And another reference which I've drew on in this project, but I also often draw on, is that of Flow City by the artist Morelli, Latham and Ukeles. And Ukeles, so let's say the emphasis of Flow City is trying to make visible many of the flows that are part of particular landscapes. I won't go into the detail, let's say, of the reference, but these types of projects have been very important in a sense from my thinking in developing many of these projects. We looked at the edge of the river. We looked at how we could pull it back, allow and encourage flooding in some areas while also making other areas, keeping other areas dry. We recognized also by the time we were shortlisted for the second stage of the competition that not showing drawings which are familiar to judges is problematic. And we were told that we needed to produce a plan. Initially, we resisted producing a single plan. We set out a framework, rather, of collecting information digitally in analog form, and then using that information to set out a very long time frame for developing the park. But by the second phase, we did develop what we could describe as a master plan, and this is it, which has many conventional aspects and themes we find in landscape architecture projects. But we also wanted to give some emphasis to, let's see if I can get this, to the relationships that are core to our work and our thinking. And this is about collecting information from the river. This is a river that floods regularly, and we propose setting a number of digital sensors across the city, across the watershed, to collect information that might be useful for people within the park, such as if the river is about to flood, then it may not be a safe place for canoeing, or if there's particular pollution in the river, it might not be safe for fishing. If there are particular birds there, this is a place of a lot of bird migration. If there's particular birds being sighted, it may be interesting for bird spotters to visit. And we developed a number of small, you might term architectures, small buildings to occupy this landscape that also could be moved around. This is a bird hide for viewing migrating birds. Before I continue, Murat, how long do we have? I don't want to overrun and bore all of your lovely students.
No, don't worry, dear. We are not overrunning. I think we're going to have some questions and answers after we are done. but I think you have at least another good 20 minutes to go.
Perfect, perfect. I will use the 20 minutes then. Thank you.
Sure, no problem.
Okay. So to continue with the Parkworks project, we have we were very interested in, it was technologies back in 2011, which I think probably we could understand more as, let's say, smart technologies, the gathering of data, but not necessarily gathering the data to facilitate an expansion of a sort of a corporate digital world of Google or Apple or Amazon, but one which the local residents, people using the park, the communities around the edge of the park could use to inform the future change of the landscape. I think importantly for us, recognizing that when you develop a design, it almost never stands still, that there's always changes, which might be about maintenance, might be about management, might be about different phases of the landscape. We're interested in how we were just, let's say, part of a story of this landscape. In addition to the digital frameworks and infrastructures that we set up, we also produced a series of small analog maps for people who may be less familiar or less comfortable working with digital. This is the diagram of the park proposal with the little dots and the crosses marking each of these nodes for collecting data. The larger crosses being larger infrastructural objects like bird hides and bridges and lookout towers. And then we also proposed setting a series of sensors across the wider regional watershed, reflecting, let's say, Geddes' advocation of the region as a measure to work with in planning. We're interested in how the relationships between the park, the river, the city, and the wider watershed, how they worked. And we tried very hard to represent these relationships in different ways, coming out of the traditions of architectural plans and sections, landscape traditions of eye level, painterly perspectives, to try to highlight some of the relationships. I think every time we try to do these drawings, I think we fail, I have to say. I think that we get there a little bit further, but they don't quite show the relational dimensions of that we're aiming to achieve. But I do think it's important for us to experiment and try out different techniques for representing these landscapes. I think we can recognize, as Dennis Cosgrove describes, that landscape today is unbounded, flexible, mobile, composed of forms and connections and spaces that are neither contained within conventional frames nor pictured according to the conventions of a distanced authoring eye. And for us, let's say, taking ourselves into the landscape is extremely important, but recognizing that we are only one of many voices in informing its future is also key. After doing the Parkswork project in 2011, we didn't win the competition, just so you know. We were shortlisted, we came through the second stage, and I think as is often the case, if you win a large commission like that, it changes your life significantly. And maybe it was good that we didn't win. But after that project, I became a little bit concerned that we were focusing on, myself and colleagues were focusing on projects which were in places unfamiliar to us. I think that when I work with students in London, I give a great emphasis to the importance of visiting places in order to understand them and research them. So I undertook a number of projects after that within London, the Lubricity project being one, and then a number of projects of which also my doctoral studies were included. And this is, I suppose, a very brief description of 10 years worth of work researching different parts of London. I spent about 8 years researching different sites of master planning in London to explore the ways in which public spaces in particular, urban public spaces, are made and remade, and the tensions, conflicts that we can find between these different ways of making public space, whether these are the day-to-day construction and operations of a low-cost market in South London's Elephant and Castle, or whether this is the large-scale transformation of a site through master planning, or policy changes by the Metropolitan Government in London. These different ways of producing public spaces, for me, are different landscapes. They're different ways in which we see and relate to the world around us. Barbara Bender, she describes that each of us, so it's not just that each of us have a different view of the world, we have multiple views. Each of us hold many landscapes in tension. And she also highlights that these landscapes they're not neutral, they are contested landscapes. And I find very much in my research looking at these 3 different sites of master planning that we can see here in Paddington Basin, Trafalgar Square, and Elephant and Castle, how the different ways in which the city is produced and remade in different cycles and rhythms can cause high degrees of concern for people living and working in these areas, but it can also highlight significant injustices in the way in which the city is produced. And we see here, I mentioned in the Patrick Geddes Valley section, we don't see the landowners and the politicians and the developers who make decisions about the large changes that happen in our cities. And this diagram here is trying to map out the location from where decisions are made and the places which are most impacted. And we see that these relationships are not relationships just defined to London, but they are also global relations between developers, economies, investment funds, and sites of urban redevelopment. I lean quite a lot within my urban work on Doreen Massey in her book For Space, which I've found consistently useful to go back to. And she talks about space, as Barbara Bender describes landscape, as always being under construction. It's always in the process of being made. It's never finished, it's never closed. Perhaps we could understand space as a simultaneity of stories so far. And it's this, let's say, this notion of the never finished, which has been at the front of much of my thinking, my concern in the work I do with our students here at Greenwich, but also in my own work, about how the landscapes we work with, if they're in process, they are never finished, but also how we begin to represent these landscapes. And when I talk about landscapes, I'm also talking about cities, how we come to represent these within drawings. And Dennis Cosgrove's writing around mappings is quite illuminating in this regard, that we can begin to see his concerns for mapping, reflecting on a wider body of research that points to the partial nature of mapping and the decisions that we make to include and exclude things from our drawings. So in one of the locations that I was researching for my PhD studies, I developed a workshop with a colleague who was looking at markets in Naples. And we developed 3 itineraries for a conference workshop to facilitate people to explore this urban landscape. Each itinerary had a different agenda, let's say, and a different way of relating to the market. Some people were introduced, we introduced some people to different market stall holders, and they worked on the market stall during the workshop. Others were given the task of going around the market and the shopping center buying different things. And others undertook maybe a more walking ethnographic approach, or observing the area. And each of the itineraries had a different map. And we constructed these maps with the knowledge we had of this particular area of London, but we wanted to focus each map on the different itineraries, but we also wanted to leave out information, to leave the maps intentionally incomplete and intentionally confusing, so that the participants of the workshop would have an opportunity to make decisions for themselves, to find out information for themselves and not just accept what they were given, and potentially to get lost also, to make sense of the world for themselves rather than being told what to do by us. And this approach, let's say, of the incomplete mapping has been something which I've continued through a series of workshops with my students in London, through a project called Incomplete Cartographies, where during our research methods class with our master's students, we've asked students to gather information of a particular place in London. Students then bring that information together and recognize some of the unique qualities and synthesize this into a single map. And then they use the map with people living, working, passing through these landscapes as a mediating device for interviews and conversations. So the students have been interviewing shopkeepers, residents, people walking their dogs in the park, people working in these landscapes, and finding out narratives which they couldn't have found out through online research or through looking at maps. They've engaged with different people in different communities. And the idea is that this isn't just about finding out a single narrative, but it's about building up a body of knowledge from a series of unique stories from individuals, and recognizing the value that we as designers have for organizing and for bringing people together and for facilitating conversations, as well as, I suppose, our abilities to envision the future. The maps for us have been extremely useful in challenging, let's say, the often artificial separation between research and design proposals, but it's also been important to underline the significant voices that people have and significant stories that people have to offer when we are developing proposals. And it also, I think, underlines, my screen's just a little bit frozen, so you might have to wait while my wheel stops spinning. It also underlines, let's say, the what Dennis Cosgrove describes as processes of mapping rather than the maps as finished objects. And this, I think, is extremely important for us to think about. How do we keep our drawings more dynamic? How do we keep our drawing in process to reflect the landscapes which we're working with, which are also in process? So you're gonna have to excuse me for 30 seconds while I just restart my slides. Let's see how we're gonna do this. Okay, stop sharing. You can see me now. Apologies for this. My PowerPoint screen just crashed on me. So let me reopen it. Okay, apologies for everybody for this slight delay. Stability of the internet is fine. Stability of my computer less so. Let's see if we can restart where I left off. Okay, hopefully you can see me again. Is that good? All right.
Yes.
So thank you. So as Cosgrove describes, we're looking at process of mapping rather than maps as finished objects. And I think that while it's not straightforward to be, or maybe it's not our priority to be reinventing techniques of representation when we're working as designers, it is an extremely important tool for us in communicating and developing our ideas. So the last project I want to share with you is something called the Valley Project. And this is this was an ongoing piece of work, which I began in 2018. And it reflects, so going right back to the beginning of my presentation, it reflects my interest in Patrick Geddes' work, but also I suppose it takes me to the particular landscape which I grew up in the Highlands of Scotland. And I think that maybe our online world makes me more nostalgic it makes me more nostalgic to where I grew up, because I'm now confined to London in many regards. But the landscape I grew up in is very, what we might understand is very picturesque. It's highly photographed. It features on many tourist postcards. And I never quite understood the visual interest of this landscape growing up within it. And I've been interested in, let's say, this sort of through my academic work, my interest in pushing away from the more scenographic emphasis that we have given to landscape within the Western world in particular, but also how landscape is a very visual medium in many respects. I'm interested that behind these pictures, as Dennis Cosgrove describes, there are other things going on. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but he talks about the silences and the powers of deception of these more visually oriented landscapes. And for me, the valley section drawing that Patrick Geddes, a diagram framework that Patrick Geddes has developed, is useful to challenge and question and pick away at these more visually oriented landscapes. So I began developing a series of my own drawings of the places which in which I grew up, and trying to make sense of through a sort of a regional scale drawing, as Geddes did, but not relying purely on the section, bringing together plan, elevation, sectional elements together in single drawings, to think about how the valley section can be useful to us through researching of places, contemporary places, but also how we might think about the future. It also allowed me, this project has also allowed me an opportunity to make more physical or explore further a lecture I gave in Milan many years ago for the expo, which was focused on food. And my colleague Antonella in Milan, she asked me to give a lecture. I don't know very much about food, particularly as it relates to landscapes, but I do know that the taste of whiskey relates quite strongly to different parts of the landscape. So if we go to the west coast of Scotland, go to some of the islands, there'll be very distinctive flavor in the whiskey and smell of the whiskey that comes from the land, it comes from the water, it comes from the raw materials, it comes from the techniques, the practices of making whiskey, and the people involved. And I developed a model which kind of explored the notion of incompleteness and a landscape constantly being produced, which also allowed an exploration of this idea of making whiskey. And I worked with a colleague, Emma, also a graduate student here at Greenwich, to develop, let's say, this knowledge of a particular landscape, and then also this model, which within it contains different vials of whiskey. So we can see as we move through the landscape, the varied relations, ways of working the landscape that go beyond the sectional diagram of Getty's, but try to draw together the unique qualities of this place, from the aquifer to the tidal estuary to the particular techniques of whiskey making. I'm building up this model piece by piece to I say, it was tell a particular story of this place. And finally, to, I suppose, highlight, let's say, the importance of work as Getty's does within his valley section drawings. I want to maybe quote Don Mitchell, where he describes the genius of landscape, that it is forever masking the work that makes it. And if in some way we can begin to use the valley section, the framework of the valley section, as a tool to clarify, to make more clear some of these ways of working landscape, then I think that our work as designers has the potential of having great impact. That is the last slide. Thank you very much. Thank you again, everybody, for inviting me. And please feel free to ask any questions.
Thank you so much, Ed. Everyone, please put your questions in the chat here. Ed, it usually takes a few minutes for the questions to come.
No, that's absolutely fine. It's very nice being back on Zoom. I spent a lot of time on Zoom in the spring, but not so much over the summer.
You are back to teaching in person?
We are back to teaching in person. We are I think we're one of the few design schools where we've been able to quite hopefully safely facilitate students coming back. Last week was the first week of the semester. So our design teaching is a combination of in-studio teaching and on-site. So we're doing a lot of site visits and that type of thing. But it is face-to-face, and our larger lectures are online. But yeah, it's in the UK, there's a big conversation about the role of universities in spreading coronavirus. So it's not something which I want to, let's say, make any conclusions on at this stage, except for, I suppose, I'm very grateful that our students are embracing the opportunity to have face-to-face teaching, particularly in the studio. I think that the lecture side, I'm less concerned with, but for a design studio, it's, yeah.
Yeah, it's a challenge.
Work to be happy.
In India, we are entirely on mandated online class, or not. Online is not mandated. Universities are not allowed to open. So
yeah,
we're making do. Everyone is using.
Yeah. It seems to be a very strange. Every country has a strange coming together of national politics, population densities, healthcare systems. I mean, it's so different in every different country. But I don't know. No one seems to be doing it perfectly.
Yeah, it's a challenge. We're hoping that things will allow us to come back together soon. But the Indian story has been very sort of, the rise in cases has been unaffected by policies and lockdowns, and they continue to rise. So that's where we are. But
yeah, we're certainly in the middle of our second wave. I think that it's, yeah, I think it'd be unwise of any country to be too proud of their results.
Yeah.
But I think looking at looking at the results per population, I think the UK is certainly one of the worst performers.
Ed, I have a question regarding your project in London, where you were looking at the public spaces in London. And two kind of questions actually. So first one is about, you said that you were mapping the stories, the narrations that people were voicing, and then how strong they were. I wanted to see how basically that the mapping was done, and also what was the result of mapping? What did you learn from the stories that people had to tell, and that gave you a new and a different perspective towards the same space that you didn't have before hearing their stories?
Yes, it's a good question. I think it was probably back in about 2014 when we restructured some of our master's programs at Greenwich. We wrote a course focused on design research methods. And I was particularly interested in how we could bring methods from different disciplines into our work as designers. And at the time, I was doing a lot of interviews for my PhD doctoral work. And I personally have found interviews to be quite a useful way of gathering data, information. But as designers, we often struggle to use text and map at the same time, and we struggle to synthesize them. So the idea really was to recognize the value of speaking to people rather than and being a bit more grounded in our practices as researchers. And mapping, we found, I thought it might be, but we found it had a usefulness in spatializing otherwise non-spatial data. So if we consider, let's say, that text is non-spatial, it's less spatial, being able to draw what is described in an interview was really useful. And so in one sense, it sort of methodologically, so the idea was that we could begin to take narratives and compare them to what might be a GIS data or other historic maps. But it was also, I think, the probably a greater recognition that there are, say, many people who have more information about the landscapes in which we're working than we do. And I suppose tracking those people down and finding opportunities for them to share their knowledge, we thought was quite important. So in all design projects, this isn't something we do in all design projects, because we don't have, let's say, a fixed methodology within the school, and I'm quite against sort of fixed methodologies. But within this particular class, it's a way of experimenting and encouraging students to do things which often we don't do enough. So some of the things that came out of, let's say, the Incomplete Cartography's work were about students recognizing that particular streets or neighborhoods have a history of music or frequency of bars and clubs and music on the street, and using that as a lens to focus conversations, interviews that were then mapped. And yeah, sometimes they were just really just about the conditions of the places. Others became a bit more focused, a bit more, let's say, contested in regard to urban development projects that were happening within neighborhoods, and people express their concerns or their issues with those works.
Thank you so much. Nimisha is asking a question. Apparently, she has been attending the landscapist talks. The landscape is for everyone who's interested in landscape and its intersection with the city. Ed organizes these amazing talks called the Landscapists. I will at the end be able to give the link in the chat. So I don't know, Ed, if it's continuing or not. Is it going to be there? Or I think for summer, the duration of summer was paused for some time.
We will have some, but it won't happen so frequently.
All right.
So I ran the seminars every day or every weekday, I think, for about 2 months or 3 months during the lockdown period in London. It mapped on almost exactly onto the lockdown period in London. And it was more, let's say, a gift to our students, which became a little sort of a much broader, interesting and sort of global conversation about landscape. But we will have some more of those later this year. We have an exhibition of work that is going to open, and we'll have a short series that will continue from that. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think it'd be great to know about that. I will be sharing the link to that at the end. So Nimisha is asking, what is your advice for the students who are graduating from landscape, considering the global scenario? I think it's a bit of a large question, but I think based on your own perspective and your own experience.
It is a big question. I think that I am generally an optimist. So I would encourage anyone who's graduating, whether you're a landscape architect or anyone else, if you're graduating round about now, to not to get too negative about the situation. I think that in the past, if we look to, in the UK at least in 2010, 11, the global financial crisis resulted in many people not having jobs. And when I graduated from one of my degrees in the 1990s, I was in a similar situation. I think that the key would be to be as focused as possible in the work that you do. And if that isn't, let's say, work being employed, then I would always recommend continuing to self-initiate projects, or to do design competitions, or to write something. I think one of the great things you have, the skills you have as designers, landscape architects, is that you can write critically and you can draw. And being able to write articles for magazines or journals, or to develop design projects which are more self-initiated, I think is a real skill. And I think that we can look at certain periods of time in history when some very interesting developments in particularly architecture, it's a bigger subject area, I think, but occurred when there was a depression in the economy. So in 1970s, there's a number of significant, let's say, architectural, let's say 60s and 70s, where significant architectural movements developed in the UK and London, because there weren't very many jobs around. And I would encourage as many of you as possible to start your own design practices and not rely on the larger employers to give you jobs, because I think that you can be better. I think that I like the prospect of working with students because I think they can change the world. And if it's just about teaching students to get the next job, it becomes a bit boring.
Thank you so much for that answer. I just want to say that I think it's, it reminded me also, I ended up in India because of the crisis in 2011. That's when I finished my degree, and there was no work in the US. And so we said, there's work in India. My partner's Indian, and we had started the practice here. So I think that's a wonderful response to that.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think starting your own practice is it's such an important thing to, let's say, recognize what your own thing is. I think as an employee, it's difficult to get that separation between your thoughts and the thoughts of your bosses.
Yeah, and I think there's something really fantastic about the fact that here we have less barriers to starting your own practice, and that means that there's a lot of possibility for young practices because there's so much work also to do. But I think there's another question I don't want to take away from them.
No problem. Ed, Vidisha is asking about the mapping of stakeholders process that you talked about. You showed the map where you map where all the decision makers are sitting as compared to where the site is. So she's asking that how do you involve the different stakeholders, and how does the analysis of this interrelationship between stakeholders affect and their interests affect the design at the end?
It's a good question. The diagram that you're describing was not part of a design project, I have to say. So that the diagrams showing the different stakeholders was part of my doctoral research, which I developed, I suppose, some propositional strategies in my conclusions, but it certainly wasn't a design project. And for that work, I was interviewing different stakeholders. So semi-structured interviews were really useful for me. And then I would transcribe those interviews, and then I would try to recognize what the issues were, various patterns or things that were missing from the conversations. And my findings and conclusions were written. They weren't drawn. The way in which, let's say, we use interviews and work with stakeholders in our design studio at Greenwich, it varies depending on the studio, I have to say. We have about 16 different tutors, and probably about 10 of which, maybe 10 or 12 of which are design tutors. And my approach in bringing them into the team is that they all do something very different, and that they're not all suggesting that research is done through interviews. They're not all suggesting design proposals are developed in Rhino. We have quite a, I think, importantly diverse body of staff. However, for myself, I think that the use of the way in which we can use interviews is through mapping and attempting to draw what is often just written. And this is something which I've written a number of, let's say, I suppose, short articles about how we do this in Greenwich through a number of, let's say, composite drawings. But I think that one of the important things is, and as a designer, is to recognize the research methods you use. They should reflect the place you're working and the information you're going to collect. But then synthesizing that information is the challenge. So for me, composite drawings, which is sort of, let's say, they're sort of usually layered map type drawings, are extremely important. If it's useful, I mean, I could certainly share some examples over the email.
Sure, I think that would be very helpful. Yeah, because like you say, the synthesis is always very important. And then since we're listening to all the stakeholders, taking a democratic position also in considering all those layers. So I think it's very interesting to look at it, like you say, as an illustration, as a map, as a visualization. Zenia is asking if you can talk about the possibilities of cohabitation, so in terms of the settlements or cities along with fauna?
Yeah, I think it's maybe it's a important question in contemporary our contemporary situation. For me, it's not even that I struggle to, because I don't see a difference between the way in which we might approach a more urban place to a more rural place. I think that there's, if we have a place that has lots of people, for example, it will create great opportunities and highly productive situations, and it will also create tensions. We have places which have fewer people. There'll be other advantages and disadvantages. I think that the question of, I suppose, bringing together settlements, cities, and fauna, there are other considerations that we bring into play, which might be around health, might be around welfare, might be around, I suppose, the benefits that can bring for people, plants, animals. So to a certain degree, it's not a very satisfactory answer, but I'd probably say every situation should be addressed based on its conditions, its histories, its cultures. And I don't think that, let's say, there's a single model or way of working. It is worth saying, however, that the human-centric nature of our cities, human-centric nature of our design approaches needs to be challenged. And I think that's something which I have to say my students are ahead of me on this. I think that my students are much more concerned around they see a strangeness in the fact that we are designing so dominantly for people. I think that whether this relates to animal welfare, or whether it relates to extinction of species or the climate crisis, I think there's a recognition from many young people of the imbalances that are caused by human activity. So I say this decentering people from, let's say, design thinking is something which I think if we did, it would and we did effectively, it would allow us to think differently about these relationships between settlements, land, fauna, flora. Yeah.
Ed, I have one more question. The work you had done for Biennale, where you were basically looking at where the social relations and the ecological factors can come together. I think I find that of quite interest, and the fact that you set the trees out in the city, and wherever the tree is, the socializing, the publicness of the space can happen because of the tree. And then at one point you said that, even somebody can take the tree and then, plant it in the garden and take care of it. The taking care of the trees, the taking care of the biodiversity that we try to infuse in the city is, I think, even as important as initially bringing them in. So do you know of some good practices or anything that relates to your research or your idea about how to maintain them, and if there are any ways that you can suggest about how even the people can be collaborate in the maintaining and upkeeping of the biodiversity within the city?
A good question. We have every year in Greenwich, we have a sort of a common conversation across all of our programs in landscape architecture and urbanism. And 2 years ago, we the focus was on maintenance, and not maintenance as something that comes after design, but maintenance as a way of thinking about the importance of these small scale actions and the care that we might take, and the potential of this as a creative practice. And we did reference, or at least I probably talked about it too much if you ask my students, we did reference a lot to the artist Mareili Leda-Mukeles and her manifesto for maintenance art, which she wrote, I think, in 1969, which is a critique of development as being something which is more elevated, usually more male, usually given greater precedence than maintenance practices, which come after, which are usually smaller scale, usually female, usually more domestic consents. And I think that for me, you know, her manifesto, but also her body of work from the late 60s, early 70s is an extraordinary, let's say, lesson for us as designers in how to not think about maintenance as something which is separate, but think about maintenance actually design as a process of maintenance.
Right.
That there's one example, I think, a project example, which is, I think, is worth looking at, and that's the project called Girona Shores in Girona in Spain, and that's by the landscape architect Marty Frank. And he working with the municipality persuaded the municipality to, he basically self-initiated a project which was about maintaining the green spaces of the city. And he worked with the maintenance workers in quite sort of, I say, revolutionary ways of sort of rethinking how maintenance is done throughout the city and developing a plan, a master plan, let's say, from these very small scale actions. And it won an award, I think, this last year, but it's something which we've been following for about 3 or 4 years as Marty's been developing the project. Because I think that it's one of the few examples where you can really see this sort of the creativity and the potential impact of care and maintenance. So yeah, I'd certainly have a look at Marty's work. Yeah, it's something for us. These different ways of say rethinking practice are a core part of, let's say, what we do at Greenwich, rather than, let's say, rethinking the outcomes of the practice. And sort of these different ways of working are quite important to us.
Thank you very much. We don't have any more questions as of now. I think we can call it a great talk. Thank you very much, Ed, for your time. And I think this has been an amazing exposure for all of our students. We have